So the Beatles always made good music. However, I think their secret talent was disagreeing. They always had something to discuss, which is fair. I think if you put four people in a room together and ask them all to agree and behave, you're kind of asking for a disaster. And I think that this disagreeing doesn't really come because anyone's particularly right or particularly wrong. It would be because each of us all live a completely unique life. Our taste and preference is subjective to what we have experienced in our time and what we've been exposed to and what we feel is important or not important based on our experiences. So, when we're talking about the Beatles, we're talking about four individually gifted people with possibly four different opinions on how something should be done or how something should sound. However, what they may have not clued into at the time was that this might have been the exact recipe that they needed. I have long asked myself, were the Beatles better together or separate? And I'll be honest, when I say that out loud, it kind of sounds really stupid because, I mean, it's probably a very straightforward answer. And after doing all the research for this podcast, I very quickly made up my mind, and you could probably guess what it was. More often than not, if you bring together a group of individually talented people, hopefully what they can produce together is going to be better than what they would have done alone, because you have four minds instead of one. But for argument's sake, let's leave the question, were the Beatles better together or apart, open-ended, and look at some of the pros and cons of working together and working alone. So I was brainstorming some of the pros and cons, and these are the ideas that I had that I felt fell into these lists. So we're going to start with working with people, the pros of working with people. The first thing I wrote was the power of brainstorm. Brainstorming is a skill I recently truly learned, and again, I feel like that sounds dumb when I say it out loud, but it was something that I didn't really know its true powers until I sat through a class on brainstorming. So now, when I have an idea for, say, this podcast, I'll just write it down, but then I'll go through and I'll brainstorm it out to see if I even had more than 5 minutes of information to talk on it. And what I'll often find is that my whole objective for that idea expands, or it switches to another view. It's like I'm unlocking a new level that I didn't even realize was there, ultimately making the original idea 10 times more interesting than before. So while brainstorming is clearly beneficial when you're doing stuff alone, I can't even imagine what a group of people could do to one simple idea. The next point I had that I thought was a pro was new perspective and experiences. This kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning of the episode, that we all have lived individual lives. We all bring new ideas to the table. There's more perspective to offer when there's more people. So, for instance, if we're talking about the Beatles, if you have Paul and he was writing a song about love, John might suggest he change one of the words because from John's point of view, he sees love much differently. Now, does this lead to arguments? Yes, but I think that's kind of the point, which we'll talk about later. The next pro is complementary skills. This is a really big one when you're in a group of people. It's also a really cool one, and it only really works in group settings because you need multiple people to complement each other. In life, there is always going to be something that you are great at and something that you're not so great at. It's just how it goes. So if you can have people that fill in those gaps, it makes all the difference when you're working on one creative project. And especially with the Beatles, when you're trying to sustain a successful career or make something that's worth listening to, if you fall short in songwriting, someone else makes up for that. But you might be better at coming up with guitar riffs than the other person. And so those things, they balance each other out to make the best song that you could possibly make. The last pro that I wrote down is reeling each other in, and I feel like this is a big one, maybe more in music than anything else. Well, actually, probably in all art, but I just think like music it's just a big thing. But it's the idea of not getting carried away with one idea, and it's maybe a Beatles targeted point. I love the Beatles, but I do feel like their collective efforts were necessary for them to produce the music that they did because of some of the solo work that you get from the Beatles. I love a lot of it, but there's also stuff that I just wouldn't listen to. And don't get me wrong, like I said, I love it, but I think the way that they held each other accountable actually helped them a lot in their case of having a long career. So now onto the cons of working together. The first one I wrote is overpowering each other. So this is obviously a risk that you take when you're working in a group anywhere. There's always going to be a personality that is more dominant and wanting more control. And in a lot of ways, I think this is actually helpful to a team, but if it goes too far, it can destroy one. It's very easy for humans to get greedy or power hungry, and when our ideas aren't the ones that are getting picked, things don't always go down well. This is definitely a downside if there's not enough accountability in a group, and expanding off this is the next side. You also get the individuals in a group who always sacrifice what they want until they break. And I can say this confidently because this is me. While I can play the victim card and say we get walked all over and our ideas don't see the light of day, I also have to take accountability for realizing that in order for my opinion to be valued, I have to value it and I have to believe in it and leave myself with confidence when I'm bringing my ideas up. And if I don't learn to do those things, then there is going to be this slow build of resentment until it's too much to hold in. And then, boom, there goes the group again, which leads me to my last con of working together. It requires more effort to agree on one thing. When there's clearly opposing opinions in a group, it can be much harder to learn to agree with each other or learn when the right time to compromise is and when you need to stand strong in your ideas. And if I'm totally honest, I think it's our job as individuals to continue to learn and grow and get better, but I'm not sure if these things can ever be overcome for good. And I know that's like kind of pessimistic, but I just think, the Beatles shared a good amount of years, but it was only that amount of years for a reason. Even if they remained friends, it ultimately got to a point where they had to be working alone. Even if they remained friends, it's ultimately clear that the way things were going, things couldn't stay the same. And it's not to say that they wouldn't have ever figured it out, but the most successful band just doesn't break up and stay that way for no reason. Which leads me into pro number 1 of working alone. And that's that business is separate from friendship. Friendship is a very special thing, and it takes 2 very special individuals to be friends and to work together, but especially to work creatively together, because to do that, it requires this deep vulnerability with the other person, which of course could result in a life-changing piece of art, but it also means that quite often they know every detail about your life, which is normal-ish for a friendship, but the difference is they're more than happy to tell you that the song you wrote about your last heartbreak is horrible and you should change everything about it. So, keeping friendship and business separate, is definitely a pro of working alone. And the last pro that I have here for working alone is that you have total control over what you make and how you make it. This allows your music to hopefully portray the most honest version of yourself and of everything that you love. Your work would probably tend to be more of an authentic reflection because it is only you contributing to the final result. It's your lyrics, your voice, how you want the guitar, how you want the piano, how you want it produced. Everything is your call, which is a beautiful thing, but like we said earlier, you also run the risk of getting too caught up in the idea that you relate to, but others might not. And this leads us into our first con of working alone. There is a lot less accountability when you're working on a solo project, which means that you run the risk of running a good idea into the ground. Something that I've probably done many times on this podcast because I quite literally write alone, read alone, edit it alone, and then record it and release it under my name. So it's a gamble, but I mean, it's just life, I guess. See, like right now, what am I even talking about? I am running this idea to the ground, so I'm going to move on. The second con I wrote is it's easier to get stuck creatively when you're working alone. This is the one we all love and know, or rather hate. I personally find that it's extremely easy to get stuck in a state of no inspiration. I think that my phone has a lot to do with this, but that is a whole other episode. And see, as I'm going to run this into the ground right now again, because I just brought up something like way too big of a topic. But I think that this is consistently the biggest issue I run into while working on this project alone. I find I spend a lot of the time staring blankly at my computer screen, and in those moments I would love having like a peanut gallery to bounce my ideas off. Did that like age me like 40 years? Why was that the phrase that came to my mind? Anyways, as you can see, I started to realize that there is more pros to working together than working alone. This solidifying the idea that the Beatles were better together than they were alone. And while the pro to working separately was that the work you produced was hopefully more authentic, what I've found with the Beatles specifically is that there was no lack of honesty in their music. They did not have to be separate musicians to make music that reflected one of their lives. As a quick example of this is the track Something, which was the first song that lead guitarist George wrote by himself that appeared on the A-side. The song Something was essentially a love song written by George about his then wife, Pattie Boyd. And the lore goes deeper than this if you want to explore into the songs that Eric Clapton wrote about the same woman. But the point is that this was clearly a topic that was specifically personal to George and only George in terms of the band. Yet each member still rallied behind him and embraced the song like it was their own story to tell. So maybe today the better question is, why were the Beatles better together? I want you to imagine that you take a journal entry you wrote and you made it into a song. It would reflect your life in the most honest way. It would be about your perspective, your story, your pain. And because of that, it would be beautiful. It would be beautiful because it would be honest. And to me, there's no argument that the Beatles did this alone, but they also did this together. But I think the real skill of the four of them is when they came together and made transformative music. Music that, through the process of creation, challenged their beliefs of how things should be done or how they should be said, and because of that, it changed them. Okay, bear with me. Imagine that same song you wrote, but imagine sharing it with your best friend who also wrote their own song. Now, imagine so many times. Anyways, imagine you have to fuse those two songs together Even though your lyrics and your melodies and opinions might be different, how are you going to take those two concepts and make one singular idea work? Because this is what the Beatles had to practice for their entire career as a band. So conflict is an interesting topic, and I think we're so quick to look at it as a negative thing, and that's understandable because it doesn't always end well. However, it will always reveal a truth. Unfortunately, more often than not, it takes a hard experience for us to see a new perspective in our lives and to look for a change. Yet, when we look to art, the idea of two opposing ideas working at the same time draws us in. We're quick to avoid conflict in our lives, but we love to watch it and try to understand it. So, why are we drawn to conflict in art, and how does it make art better? To me, when I think about why conflict in art can be engaging, it's because of the same thing I've been talking about this whole episode, that there's two perspectives at the table, which allows this magical fusion of the two ideas to take place. I recently found a musician named Noah York, and if this name is kind of familiar to you and you're a Radiohead fan, that is in fact why, is because he is Tom York's son. And when I found him, I immediately spiraled because all of his work is incredible. To me, it's so cool because you can clearly hear the Radiohead influence in his music, but it's still his own. Like, it's not Radiohead, it's his own, yet it sounds atmospheric like a lot of Radiohead does. So again, it's the idea of two different influences becoming one to make a new idea. We've been using the word ambivalence quite a lot lately, and it's because it's interesting. It feels more honest to admit that we don't have all the answers in life. Light and darkness coexisting is what actually makes them interesting. If we lived in darkness all day, it wouldn't mean anything, and the same goes for light. But because there's a switch from dark to light and vice versa, it signals to our brain that something more dynamic is happening. It means something. But I can feel myself again driving this idea to the ground, so I'm going to move it along. In life, we tend to seek out people that only agree with our opinions to avoid uncomfortable situations. But those uncomfortable situations are what actually breed good change in our lives. Think about a great conversation that you had with someone in your life. You know, like you guys were sitting out in your car in this random parking lot for way too late, or you were around a campfire. Just think about a conversation in your life that had a lasting impact on you. It's more likely than not that someone said something to you that challenged your beliefs about life. And it didn't have to start a fight, but maybe it just made you sit back and go, oh, there's another way to look at this. Maybe they provided you a new perspective on something you were struggling with, or maybe they asked you to prove why you believe in something. Regardless of the subject matter, there was a dialogue back and forth. There was questions and explanations, which meant that when you left that conversation, you were a different person. This is what conflict enforces in our lives: change. And it doesn't mean you're changing your whole personality to salvage a dying friendship, but rather maybe you're coming to terms with the idea that it's time to walk away from it. I was recently reading a blog post from one of my longtime favorite creators, Indie Blue, and it was a birthday letter that she wrote for herself. More like a love letter to the girl she was a year ago, letting her know that there would be pain, but there would also be beauty in the upcoming year. And it was such a great read. I'm going to link it all, but I want to read a piece from it because I think she highlighted the idea of conflict in such an honest way, and I just thought it was relevant to what I'm talking about right now. So, this is what she says. This year hurts, but it's also important to know that it hurts for a reason. It hurts because you love yourself more. You love yourself enough to sit with your feelings, to let them pour out of you instead of continuing to keep you sick. This year, you learn how to voice how you feel. Regardless of how it is received, it hurts to be rejected, and you will be, but you love yourself enough to keep doing it. Life hurts without those rose-colored lenses to soften the blow. No distractions to momentarily soothe our discomfort. No substances to numb the suffering. It hurts to look life directly in the eyes, but if you are anything this year, you're brave. In order for you to embrace the beauty of life, you finally understand you cannot keep running away from the darkness. You do not get to numb the pain and also relish in the ecstasy. You feel both or you feel nothing. But you love yourself enough now to know that to be human is to feel it all. You love yourself enough to stop running and to let the darkness catch up to you. There is poetry to be found when you surrender to the dark. But the beauty requires little searching. The beauty finds you where you are, vulnerable, scared, lost, and purposeless. It sits with you until your fear melts into solitude. You can't see anything, but in the stillness, you can sense it. The unexplainable comfort of knowing you are not alone. In the darkness, time ceases to exist. Three-dimensional laws lose their hold. We settle somewhere between space and time, where all versions of ourselves join as one. In the darkness, you greet your intuition like a sister separated at birth. You apologize for neglecting her, for forgetting she was always right there. She simply smiles and says, "Welcome home." In the darkness, you effortlessly find your younger self, vulnerable, scared, lost, and purposeless. You wipe her tears, validate her dreams, quiet her fears, and tell her that she is loved beyond measure. You try to explain that this pain won't last forever, that you know it's hard for her to understand because the feelings are so big, but you encourage her to trust you, because you know that the best days of her life still await her. You lived them. She had no idea how good it was going to get, if only she knew. Your little self has guidance for you too, poems to show you, dances she made up, imaginary friends she invented. She shows you how to create again, how to play again. She shows you where to put the pain. In the depths of the shadows, you dance together. In the darkness, your older self is also there. She braids your hair and holds you while you cry. You tell her how scared you are, how lost you feel, how much you miss who you used to be. You beg for perspective from the version of you who has it. And with the same compassion you showed your inner child, she wipes away your tears. She validates your dreams, quiets your fears. She tells you that you are loved beyond measure, that this pain won't last forever. She says she knows it's hard for you to understand because the feelings are so big, but you trust her because you know that the best days of your life still await you. She lived them. In the darkness, you're not scared anymore. It's the three of you. The three of us, holding hands through space and time, knowing you are never alone, knowing the girl you used to be is always there, just a few deep breaths away, knowing the girl you're supposed to be can't wait to meet you. And maybe that's what this letter is, reaching through space and time to tell you that it's going to be okay. It's going to be beautiful, not despite the darkness you will face, but because of it. It changes the way you see things in the light. Your eyes eventually adjust to the harsh glare of reality, and you find richness in the real. You realize that you don't need rose-colored lenses to see the beauty in all things, because you have a superpower now. You can see in the dark. Man, this is what I mean. Like, stepping back and heading straight into your pain is so hard. It's so incredibly painful. But did you just hear that transformation that came out of it? Like, there's this thing that you get when you listen to music where you get shivers all over your body because it's so good. And reading that out loud, word for word, just did that to me. And when I read it for the first time, I had to stop and reread and stop and reread and stop and reread because her words had the power to reframe the way I thought. Not only her, but the way I thought. And this only happens in art when it's true vulnerability and serious change. And I don't say any of this today to romanticize pain, but rather to show you that with time, perspective sheds light to life, and we will find the strength to embrace the beauty in life for the sake of ourselves. Or, in Indy's words, not despite the darkness you will face, but because of it. It changes the way you see the light. The reason that the Beatles' music still matters to this day is because they never ceased to question and challenge each other, and what they were able to create out of their disputes was able to translate to a new idea that also challenged the society and audience that was consuming it. By being creative in a group, you learn to fight for what you want, but also when to notice when someone else's idea is better. Taking pain and making it beautiful and teaching a lesson with it is the transformative experience, one that many artists find in their lifetime. But with the Beatles specifically, I believe they managed to do this often. Today's episode concludes our mini-series on the Beatles. I'm going to take a short break from doing music-centered ideas, and then we'll be right back at it with another probably British band. I hope you enjoyed. As always, all the social media and email links and sources are in the show notes. Let's let music bring us together, and don't forget to grow up slowly.